So now that we've taken a look at our first lab for this particular course, we got to see a little bit about the generic tools that we're going to use on a day in, day out basis to solve networking problems. You really need to become familiar with all the tools that I showed there, especially ping and traceroute and NSLOOKUP from time to time. Let's go ahead and summarize this section and go on to the next thing. So in this section we talked about how today's network, they have to be secured from both internal physical attacks and external attacks, and secured from network attacks as well as end user, well-intentioned users and other types of things that we just simply have to be aware of as we're deploying our networks. As far as our local area networks are concerned, Ethernet is our most common type of local area network, although there may be some of you that have to deal with older legacy technology that's still out there. But for the most part today, you should be doing most of your work with Ethernet. We're going to spend quite a bit more time in the next section talking about how Ethernet switches work in building our infrastructure for an Ethernet network. But the standards we talked about here as far as the physical and data link layer with respect to Ethernet is very important as a building block as you move forward in learning about how Ethernet works. We talked about the naming convention for the different OSI reference model PDUs, or protocol data units. Those were bits, frames, packets, and segments, and Cisco is going to expect you to know that when you're talking on an Ethernet network, you should be talking about frames, and they're processed by a mechanism called CSMACD, or Carrier Sense Multiple Access with Collision Detection. We talked about how networks are essentially collections of devices that can communicate with each other. They're designed to provide the users of the network to share data, share resources and applications, as well as for the infrastructure pieces and for the servers themselves, if you will, to collaborate and send data back and forth between themselves in a non-interactive environment. We went through the OSI reference model. We went through all the detail of each function of each layer. You may have already seen that before coming into this particular course, but understand that we really use it. When we're dealing with networking, we're going to be using it from a troubleshooting perspective. We're going to be using it, talking about it on a day in, day out basis. So if you don't understand the OSI reference model, please go back and make sure you fully understand how all those layers work. When I start later on, I start talking about layer 2 switching and layer 3 routing. I'm going to assume that you understand how this OSI reference model works and that you fully grasp the concepts that we discussed in this particular section. We talked about how IP addresses are a 32-bit address that's a 4-octet separated by periods type format. Later on, again, we're going to talk about how these addresses can be broken down, how we can summarize addresses or subnet addresses to suit our needs within our network. In our demo, we got to see how host addresses can be assigned via DHCP. They can also be manually assigned by the administrator, but in larger and larger networks, the ability to manually assign and configure and change addresses for a wide variety and wide number of hosts is a very difficult thing to do. And especially as we start looking at things like IP version 6, you're going to see that the process of manually assigning an address would be very difficult to do. And our auto configuration capabilities we have in IP version 6 is certainly much better, even better than some cases DHCP. Lastly, we finished up and talked about how overall communications work in the encapsulation and decapsulation process. We got to take a look at how Wireshark could be used as a tool for identifying traffic as it's communicating on the network. Now, I will caution you with one thing before we go to the next section, and that is Wireshark. Wireshark is a great tool to use when you're learning about networking. I strongly suggest you use Wireshark on every network you plug into. Just be cautious with that suggestion. Understand, I'm sure you've all signed documents saying I'm not going to turn a sniffer on my work network. So make sure you have permissions before you use Wireshark and use it for that particular reason. But Wireshark is a great tool to learn about how protocols are working on the network and how to identify the different types of protocols and what they're doing for you and how they're providing services.